Taiwan, a place that often gets overlooked when talking about ancient history, but I think might be one of the most interesting places on Earth, especially when looking at mythology and ancient stories. Taiwan is said to be the homeland for multiple cultures, and shows evidence of human inhabitants going back 50,000 years, back to the last ice age. They have their own flood myths, and I believe there's still much here to be uncovered archaeologically. First off, DNA studies have proven that Taiwan is the place where all the Polynesian cultures originated. There was definitely some mixing going on with Melanesian cultures as well, who originated from India and Africa. But the Polynesians, the people who inhabited places like New Zealand, Hawaii, Samoa, Easter Island, and many other islands are said to have originated from Taiwan. This is where their language group of Austronesian originated. This migration from Taiwan into the Pacific is thought to have taken place as far back as 3000 BC, when they were still using stone tools. But they did have agriculture and great seafaring capabilities. It is their canoe technology that allowed their culture to spread as far as Hawaii and Easter Island, and possibly, as we'll look into, the Americas. Polynesians in their own histories tell us they come from a sacred homeland they call Hawaii. They describe it as a holy, lush island far away in the ocean where the gods and ancestors came from. In many of their stories, the heroes will return to this land to seek wisdom and knowledge. And it's also the place spirits go in the afterlife in addition to being the original homeland. If DNA evidence is right, then that would mean Taiwan may be this sacred homeland of the gods and wisdom. However, some have argued that this land is actually one of the islands in the Pacific, possibly Hawaii or the Tahitian Islands, or possibly the Samoan Islands, or maybe the Philippines, or mainland China itself. Some have also suggested India or Africa, as this is where the Melanesians find their origin. And some believe it was somewhere in the Americas, and the Polynesians traveled east to west instead. But Taiwan as the homeland makes a lot of sense when you look at the canoe technology, which the Maori in their own histories claim the original people left the homeland in regular open-top canoes, and the greater vessels were not created until later. And they also share a lot of similarities in tradition to Chinese stories and mythologies, which the Neolithic people on Taiwan would have most likely had some similar version of. During this time around 3000 BC, it's actually believed that people from China were migrating to Taiwan. What's known as the Daipingkang culture abruptly appeared in the archaeological record in Taiwan around this time, originating from mainland China. There's been no specific culture that has been identified as being their predecessor, but similar archaeological finds points to contact with a few, all mostly located up further north in China, along the Yellow River, where we find the origin of Chinese culture that survives until today. Most scholars will tell us that this was a time of Neolithic Stone Age cultures, but Chinese histories that are thought to only be legends will tell you this was a time of the 5 emperors and the Xia dynasty, which many are starting to consider as being legitimate history and not just a myth. The first of them ruled in the year 2852 BC, according to the ancient records. And then after that period, beginning around the year 2100 BC, the Xia dynasty began, where the descendants of gods ruled and protected the people from a plague of massive floods. It was said that the waters reached all but the highest peaks, and massive irrigation projects and dams were created by these heroes of this time, most notably the character Yu, the first ruler of the Xia dynasty, who was a descendant of one of these 5 sage emperors, the Yellow Emperor. These same stories would have been known among the people migrating to Taiwan, and later to the Pacific Islands. Taiwan has its own flood myth as well. The story differs and it's hard to find a ton of details online, but from what I could gather, the story says that long ago, a group of people migrated to Taiwan by foot, during a time when the sea levels were much lower. One story says there were no mountains at this time, and no oceans, only large lakes, until something happened and the mountains were formed and waters came flooding all but the highest peaks on Taiwan. The people try to appease their god by offering human sacrifices, but eventually a giant crab comes and cuts a great snake that is blocking the waters from draining, and the sea levels subsequently fall. However, they do not recede to the level they once did, and the people are stuck on the now island of Taiwan, never to return unless they invent boats. Polynesians also have flood myths. These stories vary quite a bit from one island to the next, but one from Hawaii tells us of a man that lived long ago, a time before the travels of the demigod Maui, or the migration of Kahiki, that brought some of the earliest people to Hawaii. They call this man Nuyu, and they say that he was the first one to travel to the Hawaiian Islands. But one of the gods sent a massive flood that submerged all the land. However, another god instructed Nuyu to build a great canoe with a house on it, and when the waters receded, he washed up on the summit of the largest mountain on earth, Mauna Kea, on the Big Island. Oddly enough, geological history tells us Taiwan and China were in fact connected by land in our not too distant past. This was the result of the Younger Dryas cooling around 13,000 to 11,000 years ago, which left the planet with entirely different land masses than we have today. And it took thousands of years for these ice caps to melt, and the oceans to get to where they are today. The area between England and France was exposed until 6500 BC. Tasmania and Papua New Guinea were connected to Australia during this period. Beringia, the land between Russia and Alaska, was exposed. The Korean peninsula was connected to Japan, and Florida was connected to the Bahamas. From what I could find, at least for the region around Taiwan, the ocean levels were 120 to 130 meters lower than they are today during this time of the Younger Dryas period. So this story that comes to us from Taiwanese mythology could actually be accurate, that the people migrated over land, and then a huge flood, the ending of the Younger Dryas cooling period, came and stranded them there. But instead of building canoes and turning back to China or staying there, they turned their ships the opposite direction and sailed as far as the Americas, creating the largest culture on Earth by area at the time. The New Zealand Maori speak of these epic journeys from the sacred homeland in their primitive canoes in their histories. But these original people could not have been as primitive as historians think. If they were the predecessors to the Polynesians, they would have possessed that sacred knowledge that all these very ancient cultures around the world possess for some unknown reason. Advanced knowledge of the stars and celestial cycles, megalithic building techniques, and ancient knowledge of the gods that relates to cultures as far back as the Sumerians, and even before that at sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. The Sumerians would have been thriving at this time around 3000 BC. And of course, we also find this knowledge in the Polynesian cultures. Their understanding of our planet and the universe around them was what allowed them to travel so far and reach these remote spots. And on these various islands, we can point to multiple sites where unexplainable structures sit. Easter Island is the first that comes to mind, with the massive moai statues and cyclopean-looking megalithic walls. But also on an island known as Pohnpei, where we find the site of Nan Madol, a massive series of complexes made entirely out of giant megalithic columns of basalt. Nobody knows how it got there, and not even the locals believe the story the historians tell us, which is that it was built around the year 1200 by a Stone Age people floating these columns on rafts. The entire complex actually extends out into the ocean in some areas, and sits intact several meters underwater, so they couldn't have been made around 1200, but that fact gets ignored. It's only thanks to people like Graham Hancock that actually investigate this stuff, why we know these underwater structures are there. And what do you know, the last time these areas were exposed above the ocean was during the Younger Dryas period. And of course, in the Polynesian histories, they tell us they were usually following stories of previous divine or semi-divine travelers that made the journey in an age past, just like with that flood myth story from Hawaii. There's also the star mounds in Samoa, and nobody knows what they're for or how they got there, not even the locals. The consensus is that they were used for some kind of ceremonial purpose, but the fact that the locals had no idea about them and it took LiDAR scanning to find them tells me they might have been much more ancient. And the star shapes point to them being used for some other purpose than ritualistic, possibly a calendar or navigational marker of some kind. We also have the Tiki character that shows up in Polynesian mythology. In Maori, the Tiki is said to be the predecessor of man, the first being that God created, and the depictions of them can be pretty weird. They have these huge eyes and elongated skulls, just odd. One idea that's been brought up is that the first Polynesians were actually traveling along more ancient routes, first created by a race of dwarves, possibly related to the story of the tiki. It sounds crazy, but we do know that the hominid known as Homo floresiensis lived in Indonesia around 50,000 BC, and very possibly for some time after that as well, and only stood 3.5 feet tall. And what do you know, in Hawaiian native history, they tell us of a people they call the Menehune, who stood around 3 feet tall and inhabited Hawaii long before humans got there, which I think could have some sort of relation to these hobbit hominids from 50,000 BC. So we talked about how the early Taiwanese around 6,000 to 3,000 BC migrated to the region, possibly across a land bridge or shallow sea, from China, which was in its mythological dynasty age, where the descendants of gods ruled. But do these Chinese histories speak of Taiwan at all? Well, it's a strong possibility they do. We have one story of a sacred land to the east of China, an island where the divine 8 immortals reside, in their great mountaintop golden palaces. It's said that they practice an original form of Taoism and live forever due to a magical peach tree. Many characters in Chinese histories attempted to travel there to seek wisdom and immortality, and none to this day have definitively identified where this land was. The Chinese histories do, however, tell us of a giant tree that grows there, known as the Fusong tree. Many speculate this to have been California, and I have a whole video on this if you want to go check that out. I'll link that in the description. But Taiwan also has some remarkably sized trees. They call them Zhenshi Bao, divine cedar trees, and the tallest today is 84 meters, but theoretically they could have gotten up to 90 meters in ancient times. For reference, the tallest redwood today is 115 meters, so this very well could have been the sacred Fusong. This magical place of immortality actually sounds a lot like the Polynesians described their homeland, where the gods and heroes first came from. Then there's the possibility that the Taiwanese might have even been the predecessors to groups in the Americas. It is a huge mystery how cultures like the Olmec and Mayans and early Peruvians sprang up. In Peru, on the coastal regions, a pyramid building culture known as the Norte Chico sprang up around 3600 BC. And in Central America, the Olmec were the first to create a written language in the region around 1300 BC. And in both these regions, there have been some research done that indicates some mixing of DNA with Polynesians took place at some point. We also have the journey of the sweet potato, which has been found as far as New Zealand and the Cook Islands from ancient times. But it is native, of course, to South America, among these early Peruvian and Bolivian cultures. The great traveler from Polynesian mythology known as Maui, a descendant of the gods, was said to have been all over the Pacific in an age during the migration of the Polynesians, after they had left their homeland. He was said to have traveled to a land no one had identified, even going to a place called A Peru or A Peru, sounding very similar to Peru. Although we have no way of knowing what they would have called this land at this time. But maybe he was the one who brought writing and civilization to the people here, and maybe he taught them pyramid building. In Peru, we find a story from the Inca that was told to the early explorers of a land to the west off the coast that is full of gold. And we also have the story of El Dorado, which comes to us from native Colombians. And one explorer took this information and set sail out to find it. He eventually discovered Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, named that because he was looking for the sacred land spoken of in the Bible, the land of Ophir, where Solomon got the sacred gold to build the first holy temple, possibly referring to this same sacred land of the Fusong tree from Chinese mythology, where the 8 immortals reside in their golden temples. The Peruvians also tell stories of giants arriving on their shores. If you want to read the whole story, I'll link that below. It's from the writings of Garcilaso de la Vega. In this story, a group of giants arrive on the Peruvian shores in huge reed boats and terrorize the natives, taking their land and waging war, only to eventually be driven back to sea or south to modern-day Chile and Argentina. And we also find these stories of giants in various islands, Solomon's being one of them. And I have a video on that too, I'll link that below as well. So maybe there were many more travelers than previously thought. Or maybe Maui himself was one of these giants. He was a demigod after all. So all that we've talked about here originated from Taiwan, and China before that. The Chinese tell us this was the time when the gods ruled, and the Polynesians tell us this was their sacred land from where their gods and their descendants came from. Thanks for watching this one. Please leave a comment letting me know your thoughts, or if you have anything else to add. Also, if you like this channel and want to help support us, go check out the Patreon. If you become a member, you'll get all these videos ad-free, and I also post quite a bit of interesting things there you won't want to miss. And it's only $3 a month to sign up. You'll be making a huge contribution to this work we do here, so I'd really appreciate that. Thank you for watching again, and I'll see you in the next one.